Thank you for the introduction, and thank you very much for inviting me to this series of lectures on the springtime of the Renaissance, which is, I think, an elegant response to the idea of the autumn of the Middle Ages, a phrase coined a century ago by the Dutch historian Johan Huizinga. And like Huizinga, I'm a cultural historian, not an art historian, and my role in this series is to offer a few thoughts about the Renaissance in general, about the idea of the Renaissance. Though more exactly, there's not one idea of the Renaissance, but at least two. One of them is a modest idea, and the other one is rather grand. Now, the modest meaning is the older one. It was current, especially in the 18th century, viewing the Renaissance as a movement in art, literature, philosophy, and other domains. By contrast, the grand meaning goes back to the 19th century. If you like, it's to talk about the Renaissance with a capital R. So the idea is that it was a period of history, of European history in particular, that forms part of a grand narrative of the rise of Western civilization and the rise of modernity. So one step, the Renaissance, then the Reformation, then the Scientific Revolution, then the Enlightenment, and so on. Now, the problem with the grand view is that it's odd to give a certain name to a period when the majority of people living in that period had no idea that anything like the Renaissance was going on. Even in Italy, the majority of the population lived in the countryside. They had virtually no opportunity to participate in the movement, or maybe even to hear names such as Leonardo da Vinci or Michelangelo. So what follows will be an exploration of the modest idea, focusing, as I was asked to do, on the springtime of the Renaissance in the 15th century, but saying something as well about, let's call it, the early summer that followed it in the 16th century. Now, I believe that to understand this movement, like any other movement in the past, it's extremely important to discover what the people participating thought they were doing. I'm not saying that historians should always limit themselves to echoing the views of people who lived in the period they study. But I do want to argue we should always take their views of themselves into account. Speaking very generally, I'd like to suggest that the function of historians resembles that of translators. In our case, we translate between the past and the present. Like translators between languages, we walk a kind of tightrope which is stretched between two opposite dangers. On one side, the danger of infidelity to the past, the problem of anachronism. But on the other side, the problem of unintelligibility in the present. So we have to make the past intelligible to the people of our own time. And so, before we can do this translation, we need to study the language of the past very closely in a literal sense as well as a metaphorical sense. So, I will say something about a series of metaphors. In the 15th and 16th centuries, scholars, often described today as humanists, claimed that learning and the arts had been reborn, revived, or awakened from sleep. And they argued, I think they really believed, that this sleep had lasted for more than 1,000 years, the period that they were the first to call the Middle Ages, medium aevum. And they viewed the Middle Ages as a time of darkness and ignorance, located between the glories of ancient Greece and Rome on one side and the hoped-for glories of the present and the future on the other. So we don't have to dismiss the Middle Ages like this. There were many achievements to the credit of medieval people, but we do have to try to enter into this mentality, prejudice if you like, but an influential one at the time. Yet another metaphor in use at this time was that of disinterment. The painter Giotto, for example, was praised for having brought back to light that art which had been buried for many centuries, a vivid metaphor that was probably suggested by the number of statues, coins, and other elements of ancient material culture that were emerging from the earth at this time, especially in Rome, where it was so easy already in the 15th century to dig up the past. So in what follows, I want to begin by discussing the Renaissance as a revival. But then, this will sound like turning everything upside down. I want to continue by examining it as a movement of innovation. And I shall conclude briefly by asking the question whether or not there is a possible third way between these rival interpretations. So to begin with revival, in Latin, renovatio. This was a recurrent word in the Renaissance. It was used to the dream of emulating the great achievements of ancient Greece and Rome, especially at that time, Rome, or even of bringing antiquity back to life in a kind of resurrection, or as they sometimes wrote, resuscitation. And the first point I want to make about this dream is that although it was obviously unrealistic, it had extremely real consequences. It helped to shape the culture of the 15th and 16th centuries, first in Italy and then in other parts of Europe. But a second point about the dream concerns the enthusiasm for the culture of the ancient world. I think admiration is simply not a strong enough word to describe this passion, this enthusiasm. I would prefer to say that there was an increasingly widespread veneration for antiquity, an increasing emotional investment in this classical past. And there was also a new sense of intimacy with ancient poets, orators, philosophers, statesmen, and historians. And I'd like to illustrate this sense of intimacy with two concrete examples, beginning with the poet-scholar Francesco Petrarca in the 14th century. Just a second, I hope this is it. Yeah. We don't know what Petrarch looked like, but this picture is irresistible, at least as a vivid depiction of a scholar in his study, surrounded by all the equipment necessary for reading and writing. Now, Petrarca wrote letters to some of the ancients as if they were still alive. He wrote letters to 8 Romans, including Cicero, Virgil, and Livy, and he wrote a letter to 1 Greek, Homer. He couldn't read. He began learning Greek. He didn't know enough Greek to read Homer in the original, but he realized Homer was a very great poet. Turning now to Machiavelli. This is a posthumous portrait, but it's likely to be a much more reliable representation of Machiavelli than the other one was of Petrarch. Now, as everyone knows, Machiavelli was tough-minded. He was a man absolutely determined to avoid illusions. And therefore, I think it's extremely significant that he once wrote to a friend that when he studied ancient writers, he put on his best clothes as a mark of respect. In what has been called the most famous letter of the Renaissance, he wrote as follows. I'll quote you the bit. "When evening comes, I go home and enter my study. On the threshold, I take off my muddy, sweaty, everyday clothes. I put on robes fit for courts and palaces. And so, dressed decently, I enter the old courts of the ancients, and they welcome me. And there I am not embarrassed to speak to them and to ask them about the reasons for their actions. And they, with courtesy, answer me." Now, as I said, the Renaissance movement was a minority movement. But scholars were not the only people to venerate antiquity. If one looks at the names that were given to children in the 15th century, we see that figures from the classical past were viewed as role models, as we would say. One common classical name for girls was Lucrezia, as in the celebrated case of Lucrezia Borgia. Though you might not think, looking at this rather restrained portrait, that she had the flamboyant lifestyle that has made her celebrated. Another popular name for girls was Cassandra, as in the case of a 15th century scholar, Cassandra Fedele. And then turning to boys, think of Caesar, in the case Cesare Borgia, Lucrezia's brother. Or think of Hercules. Ercole d'Este was the late 15th century ruler of the city-state of Ferrara. And even more significant, or even more of a surprise at least, is that naming children in this way was not confined to elites. Take the case of a 15th century bookseller who was named after a Roman emperor, Vespasiano da Bisticci, whom we know about because he wrote an account of his meetings with his distinguished clientele. In Venice, even a street cleaner is recorded to have named his two sons Camillo and Virgilio. But of course, he too lived in an urban world where it was possible to hear something about ancient Rome, even if you were unable to read or write. Of course, there was a downside to this attitude of more than enthusiasm. Veneration for ancient thinkers made it difficult to challenge their ideas, their authority. Among philosophers, the ideas of Aristotle were still dominant, as they had been in Europe since the 13th century. Though interest in Plato and his followers was increasing and sometimes became a cult. In medicine, the great authorities remained the Greek physician Hippocrates and the Roman Galen, who was what we might call a sports doctor, since his job was patching up gladiators so that they would be able to fight another day. Turning now to literature, the imitation of other writers is condemned in our culture as plagiarism. But in the 15th century, imitating the classics was considered to be a virtue rather than a vice. What we think of as creativity or originality consisted at that time in what might be called transposition. By this I mean the skillful adaptation of a classical model to a rather different purpose. In this way, epics imitated Virgil's Aeneid. Petrarch was one of the people to write such an epic called Africa, celebrating the deeds of the Roman general Scipio Africanus. Comedies imitated the plays of ancient Roman playwrights, including Machiavelli's comedy Mandragola. Historians imitated Livy, assimilating the rise of Florence or Venice to the rise of ancient Rome. And dialogues, of which there were so many in the Renaissance, imitated Cicero. In the revival of the classical style of architecture, a text surviving by the Roman architect Vitruvius played a similar role as a source of good practice to Cicero as a model of elegant prose. But of course, in the case of architecture, good practice could not be derived from texts alone. And so, in the early 15th century, the Florentine engineer-architect Filippo Brunelleschi went to Rome in order to study and measure ancient buildings. On this visit, Brunelleschi was accompanied by his friend, the sculptor Donatello. And Donatello was inspired by the classical sculpture he could see in Rome, including the equestrian statue of the Emperor Marcus Aurelius, to be seen to this day on the Capitol, except that what you see now is a copy because the original is too precious and it's now in a museum. I should say that at the time, the Romans did not think that this statue was of Marcus Aurelius, but of the Christian Emperor Constantine. But in any case, it was an inspiration for Donatello's own equestrian statue of the mercenary soldier who was nicknamed Gattamelata and who can still be seen in Padua on Piazza del Santo. One important thing about this statue, it marks what has been called the emancipation of the statue from the niche, since in the Middle Ages, the many statues that were made to form part of an architectural ensemble. But now, in the 15th century, you find statues standing on their own, as in ancient Greece and Rome. And Donatello's statue, as you know, was the first in a long series of bronze horsemen that were still being erected in Europe and the Americas in the 19th and even the 20th centuries on city squares. Other ancient Roman statues provided models for Renaissance sculptors, and particularly close to ancient art were the productions of a goldsmith active at the court of Mantua. Indeed, for this reason, he was nicknamed L'Antico, the ancient one, and his work included the restoration of ancient statues, as well as his own miniatures, bronze statuettes of ancient gods such as Apollo and ancient heroes such as Meleager, whom you see there. Meleager was famous as a huntsman, and so it's likely that the object in his hands is just the broken shaft of the kind of spear that was used in the ancient world for hunting wild boar. Some people saw collecting fragments of the past as a kind of salvage operation. One 15th century scholar, the historian Flavio Biondo, who wrote a book about ancient Rome, an imaginative reconstruction of the buildings of the city. And he compared his work to the collection and reassembly of planks from a shipwreck. I have tried, he wrote, from these fragments to give an account of the whole ship. And Biondo's enterprise was driven not only by the general veneration for the classical past, but also by the sight of the daily dilapidation of ancient monuments in Rome and elsewhere, the stones constantly being removed to be recycled using the marble in new buildings. And now, collecting and possessing Greek and Roman artifacts also allowed their owners to reduce, if not to abolish, the sense of distance from antiquity. They were helped by the fact that a few statues emerged virtually whole from the earth at this time, as if to illustrate the idea of the rebirth of the ancient world. And they included this famous group, the Laocoon, illustrating a scene from Virgil's Aeneid, in which a Trojan priest and his sons are attacked by snakes. The group belonged to Pope Julius II and was displayed at the time, the beginning of the 16th century, in his sculpture garden in the Vatican. But even small fragments from the material culture of antiquity were coveted by collectors. Coins, for instance, or cameos, or inscriptions on pieces of marble, or broken statues, and so on. And since Roman coins were so common, scholars as well as princes could form collections, valuing these objects as for their portraits of Roman emperors, and sometimes for their miniature reproductions of ancient monuments. 15th century collectors of antiquities included some artists, notably Mantegna, and his friend, the scribe, poet, alchemist, and eccentric Felice Feliciano. Felice is not a famous man, but I mention him because he wrote us a letter that survives, which describes a visit that he made with his friends, including Mantegna, to the shores of Lake Garda in the year 1464. And so this group went to have a picnic, but they also searched for antiquities. They copied inscriptions, and they gave themselves playfully ancient Roman titles. So one was a consul, another was an imperator, and so on. It's one more sign of identification with the classical past on the part of some people living in 15th century Italy. Another enthusiast for antiquity was a merchant named Ciriaco d'Ancona. Now, Ciriaco was enterprising enough to travel widely in the Eastern Mediterranean for a mixture of commercial and antiquarian reasons, and he did this in the decades immediately before the conquest of Constantinople by the Ottomans under Mehmed II in 1453. And many of his sketches of ancient monuments have survived, which is marvelous because it shows the condition they were in the 15th century, sometimes rather different from their condition later. He sketched the pyramids, and here, as you see in this image, he sketched the Parthenon. Long before the late 17th century, when the Parthenon was used as a storehouse for gunpowder and blew up in the course of a war between the Venetians and the Turks, damaging it rather badly. Now, in general, I think the collections of relics of antiquity, like the ideas of imitation and renewal, reveal a sense of inferiority relative to classical culture. They reveal what Australians in their vivid, demotic English describe as a cultural cringe. And this sense of inferiority to the past, as well as a sense of distance from it, was expressed in a famous remark by the historian Guicciardini, according to whom it was a mistake to try to imitate the Romans. That passage is almost certainly aimed at his friend Machiavelli, who believed that it was a good idea to imitate ancient Romans in politics as well as in sculpture and architecture. But according to Guicciardini, it was a big mistake. Doing this, so he wrote, would be to expect an ass to race like a horse. You may think now that it's rather odd to speak of a sense of inferiority held by artists and writers in a period that is now so famous for its works of art and literature. However, it's worth remembering that before the year 1500, many of what we call Renaissance classics did not yet exist. There was no Raphael yet, no Michelangelo, and later no Descartes, no Galileo, no Shakespeare, no Cervantes, no Velasquez. So a sense of inferiority is understandable. And novelty sometimes looked like a bad thing. But even in the 15th century, and much more in the 16th, novelty was praised. So it's time now to examine the springtime of the Renaissance from the point of view of innovation. For us, the word new generally has positive associations. In the 15th century, it generally had pejorative associations. And so, justifying innovation by describing it as revival was sometimes a good strategy. Whether or not it was a conscious one, that's very difficult to tell. Martin Luther justified his break with the Catholic Church by saying it was just a return to the early Christian church, Ecclesia Primitiva. Copernicus justified his daring idea that the sun was at the center of the universe, not only with technical arguments, but also by quoting the opinion of a few ancient Greek astronomers who had had the same idea already, though they couldn't prove it. Only a few artists and scholars were bold enough to boast that they had created something completely new. Despite Machiavelli's respect for ancient Rome, he began his commentary on Livy, the famous Discorsi, with the boast that he had left the beaten track in order to follow a path that had not been trodden by anyone. Those are his words. And more generally, it was argued that the classical tradition needed to be updated, adapted, or as they normally said at the time, needed to be accommodated in order to suit the needs of their own time. For example, take the case of Erasmus, seen here in the famous portrait by Holbein. Now, Erasmus made the idea that new things require new words into a central theme of a dialogue which he called the Ciceronianus, in which one speaker says, if Cicero could return to Earth in the 16th century, then he would write differently because the world is different. And going a bit further, one speaker in the dialogue, almost certainly expressing the ideas of Erasmus himself, went so far as to claim that the real Ciceronian is the one who diverges most from Cicero, since Cicero, in his own time, diverged from the models before him. And a similar point was made in another dialogue, published by coincidence in the same year as the dialogue by Erasmus, 1528, and that is the treatise on the courtier by Baldassare Castiglione, whom you see here in a portrait made by Raphael, who was a very good friend of his. In this debate about the qualities that are necessary in the perfect courtier, one speaker puts forward the idea that, I quote, if we wish to imitate the ancients, we won't imitate them, because the ancients had not imitated anyone. So a great a debate about imitation. Do you imitate the spirit, or do you imitate the letter of antiquity? Now, despite the general prejudice against novelty, there were a few contexts in this time, especially in discussions of the arts, in which the word new was regularly used as a term of praise. At the end of the 13th century, Dante had already coined the phrase dolce stil nuovo, the sweet new style, to describe his own poetry and that of some of his contemporaries. In the case of music, the phrase ars nova was used about a new style that originated in the 14th century and developed in the 15th. In the visual arts, the sculptor Lorenzo Ghiberti described what he called the new art of Giotto and his followers, contrasting it with what he called the crude images of the Byzantine tradition. Maniera greca, he would call it. For his part, the scholar Leon Battista Alberti referred to the rise of arts and sciences unheard of and never seen before in his own time, taking the example of the Florentine circle of friends, which included himself, Brunelleschi, Donatello, and the painter Masaccio. And by the end of the 15th century, some new discoveries and inventions were evoking considerable interest, including the ones associated with Gutenberg and Columbus. The Italian scholar Polydore Vergil published a treatise about inventors and discoverers, discussing the origin of techniques and institutions such as agriculture, architecture, the art of war, the English Parliament, and so on. One might indeed call Polydor the inventor of invention. And of course, a still more famous example of the collective approval of novelty was the discussion of the discovery of the New World, which was already known as the New World by the year 1503, if not before. And since the Americas were unknown to the ancient Greeks and Romans, this discovery helped undermine the authority of antiquity, so much so that Western thinkers stopped believing that they could find all important truths in ancient books. A few scholars at the time engaged in a rearguard action, arguing that the ancient Greeks and Romans had known about America, but I'm afraid that their arguments were not very convincing and were not taken very seriously even at the time. Now, turning to painting, I now would like to suggest that by the end of the 15th century in Italy, there was established what I'd like to call a tradition of innovation. Of course, that sounds like a contradiction. It's certainly an oxymoron, but I think it's an illuminating one. My point is, Renaissance artists were still trained by apprenticeship to masters, as they had been in the Middle Ages. But nevertheless, when they became masters in their turn, some of them were able to develop the individual styles by which we now recognize the difference between, say, a painting by Leonardo da Vinci and a painting by his master Verrocchio. And this idea of an individual style of painting, a personal manner or air, was already current in Italy in the 15th century. You find it in a remarkable document in which an agent of the Duke of Milan is writing a report to his master, and who wished to commission a painting from a Florentine artist, but he wasn't sure which one to choose. And so the agent, to help him, distinguished between the styles of 4 leading Tuscan painters. There was the manly air of Botticelli, aria virile. There was the sweeter air of Filippino Lippi, aria più dolce, and so on with the other 2. Now, painters were, of course, in a different situation to their colleagues in sculpture and architecture when you think about their relation to the classical tradition. Painters might be said to have been forced to be free at this time because there were no ancient paintings available for them to imitate. Well, it's true, some decorative details were known, but our knowledge of ancient Roman frescoes effectively goes back only to the 18th century, when during the excavations of Pompeii and Herculaneum. And composers of music were in a similar position to painters, even though serious attempts to reconstruct ancient music, ancient Greek music in particular, from literary sources were made in the 16th century, notably by Vincenzo Galilei, the father of the more famous Galileo, in this treatise on ancient and modern music. Maybe if I can just draw your attention to the word modern on the title page, because it's a word in use at the time, though still not very common. And in similar fashion to the musicians, a few painters attempted to reconstruct lost works by ancient artists, especially the Greek painter appellees, although the only guide they had were rather brief descriptions in ancient texts. One example is The Birth of Venus by Botticelli, and since everyone knows this painting, I didn't think I needed to show it. But what's not so well known is that Botticelli was imaginatively reconstructing a lost painting by Apelles of Aphrodite emerging from the sea, described in a paragraph by the Roman writer Pliny. So that brings me back to imitation. Imitation in this period was not slavish. It was often viewed as emulation. In other words, an attempt not to copy, but to outdo ancient models. For instance, a 15th century poet, Latin poet, Matteo Reggio, now almost forgotten, was bold enough to add a 13th book to the Aeneid in order to show the world he was able to rival Virgil. Now, and innovation was, of course, easier if you were writing in the vernacular rather than in Latin. Petrarch's sonnets, for instance, took a non-classical form and then became models in their turn for so many later poets, not only in Italy, but in France, England, Spain, and elsewhere. And innovation was driven by competition, by the need to distinguish oneself from rivals. So those individual styles that I mentioned a moment ago, it's maybe not unfair to compare them to what we call brand recognition. You had to distinguish yourself from your rivals. You had somehow to stand out. And Florence in particular, in the 15th century, might be described as a culture of competition, as contemporaries were very well aware. In Alberti's famous dialogue on the family, one of the speakers compares life to a boat race, in which, he said, it is necessary to sweat to be first. And competition was encouraged by the social milieu. Remember that Florence at this time, although it was large for the period, it would have had fewer than 100,000 inhabitants. It means it was small enough to be, in certain respects, a face-to-face society. It was easy to bump into your friends on the piazza, and indeed it was difficult to avoid meeting your enemies in the same place, as in the notorious occasion when Leonardo and Michelangelo confronted one another. And rivalry was institutionalized in Florence and elsewhere in this period. Sometimes it took the form of races, like the Palio of Siena, an unusually surviving example of a custom that was current in so many Italian cities in the 15th century, encouraging the rivalry of different quarters of the city. Again, different quarters of the city confronted one another in mock battles, such as the so-called fist wars in Venice, in which the inhabitants of one quarter, the fishermen, were opposed by the inhabitants of another quarter, the carpenters, a battle for control of a certain bridge, in which sometimes lives were lost because some combatants were pushed into the canal. A less violent example is that of official competitions for important commissions in architecture and sculpture, as in the most famous case of all, I think, the competition to design the bronze doors of the baptistry in Florence. Brunelleschi competed with Ghiberti, and a diarist writing at the time wrote, "The whole city is divided between partisans of these two artists." Ghiberti won. And the notorious rivalry between Leonardo and Michelangelo was encouraged when the two artists were given the same commission. Each of them was asked to produce a painting of a battle scene on the walls of the town hall, the Palazzo Vecchio. So competition engendered innovation, and in its turn, innovation engendered self-confidence. In the case of painting, Botticelli and Mantegna came to be viewed as equals of Apelles. And in the case of sculpture, Michelangelo was described as having outdone not only the moderns, but the ancients as well. And a few individuals went so far as to claim that the general achievements of their age were equal, if not superior, to those of ancient Greece and Rome. So that brings me to the final problem. How can we reconcile the apparent contradiction between Renaissance as revival and Renaissance as innovation? Today it seems clear, at least to some scholars, that reconciliation often did take place, and also that it took the form of hybridization between the old and the new. Such hybridization was actually inevitable, since the revival of antiquity began taking place in late medieval culture. That means that classical antiquity was necessarily perceived through medieval eyes. And in architecture, given the practical needs that buildings have to meet, hybridization was once again a necessity. The design of ancient temples, for instance, was adapted to the needs of patrons of churches and other buildings. A few Italian churches were designed with a circular plan, although some of the clergy and others disapproved of it because they thought the cross pattern was better because it was the cross of Christ. So what I show you is not technically a church. It's a shrine of Christian martyrs next to the church of San Pietro in Montorio in Rome. It was built at the very beginning of the 16th century, commissioned by the King and Queen of Spain, Fernando and Isabel, to contain the relics of Christian martyrs. But it became known by the public as the Little Temple, the Tempietto. So it is at once classical and Christian. And then on occasion, classical and medieval traditions might be juxtaposed rather than combined. The facade of a church might be classical, as in this case. So the Cathedral of Pienza, a city which was not originally called Pienza, but when someone from the city became Pope and took the name Pius II, then he rebuilt the center of his hometown, but and ordered the change of name to something like his own name. But now, this looks like a classical facade, but what happens when you go inside? What you see is essentially a late medieval church. And so it's reconciliation in a way but only by keeping the two combatants apart. But occasionally, you see something more remarkable, a building that doesn't look either classical or medieval, but I think something quite new. Now we're in Prague. The hall in the Royal Palace in Prague was transformed by the architect Benedict Reed into a building in which a late Gothic style is not juxtaposed to, but really it's fused with the new ornamental vocabulary of the Italian Renaissance, and yet it becomes a seamless whole. Remarkable achievement. And so it's time to conclude. Should we describe the history of the arts in the Renaissance in terms of revival or innovation? Of course, the title of this lecture presented the contrast in order to catch your attention. But I believe that the problem should not be reduced to one of either or. A better answer is surely both. In practice, we find examples both of the literal-minded imitation of antiquity and the attempt to recapture its spirit while adapting ancient forms to new needs and new desires. On some occasions, classical and medieval cultures were in conflict, obviously the pagan versus the Christian. On other occasions, we find harmony, as in the architecture of Benedict Reed in front of you on the screen. When we examine the views of contemporaries, we find a variety of opinions. Some of them expressed a certain ambivalence about the classical tradition, thus combining both veneration and critique. Returning for a moment to Matteo Veggio, his 13th book of the Aeneid reveals both deference to the example of Virgil and the desire to emulate or even surpass him despite the fame of Virgil. And something similar might be said about the relation of both Botticelli and Mantegna to Apelles, even though they were unable to view the work of the master whom they both emulated. So, to sum up, to my mind, it impoverishes the idea of the Renaissance to view it either as simple revival of antiquity or indeed a simple innovation, rather than the complex mixture of veneration and competition that I've presented to you today. And thank you for your attention. Thank you.